This had the potential to be so incredible, but one choice made that impossible. For those of you who don't know, which I have to assume is most of you, Dolls of New Albion is a 90-minute steampunk opera written by Paul Shapera and released in 2012. It is actually the first of 3 operas in a trilogy which tell the story of the city of New Albion and various characters living there within. Before I get into this, if you haven't listened to the album, I would highly recommend doing so before watching this video. Full disclosure, there is a suicide in this opera. It's not specifically shown or really mentioned in any graphic way, but it is there and I wanted to let you know just in case. Links to where you can purchase the album are down below, or you can actually find it here on YouTube as well. As I said, it's only 90 minutes, so it's not too much of a time sink at all, and besides, you'll probably find yourself enjoying the music because it is actually really good. I personally have listened to this album since it came out 9 years ago, but only recently rediscovered it. I sat down and watched a live performance of the opera performed by the Clockwork Heart Productions, and honestly, I would not recommend watching this version. In fact, in the description I have linked to the performance produced by Paul Shapera himself, which in my opinion is significantly better. If you want to watch a live performance, that's the one I would recommend going with. With no offense meant at all towards anyone at Clockwork Productions, that performance did have several flaws which, in my opinion, took away from the opera. Unfortunately, some of the singing and performances aren't really that good, and it's clear they were a little more focused on the dancing than on anything else. Now, if you know anything about me, then you know that I am a cynical person. I complain about a lot of things, and I really don't know how my girlfriend puts up with it. I'm just glad she does. So as I was watching this performance from Clockwork, I was commenting to her about it and the things I didn't like, and it actually forced me, for the first time, to pay attention to the story. Before then I had kinda just put it on as background music and enjoyed it. Originally I wanted to make a video specifically about this particular performance and the flaws it had. And a quick background on me to explain that, I do have 20 years of music experience and several years of theater and musical theater experience, both performing and behind the scenes. While by no means would I consider myself an expert like someone like Sideways, for instance, I do know a thing or two about all this, and well, long story short, just watch the one I've linked down below. For those of you who haven't done that, or for those of you that have and now realize the meaning of this video's title, this is the point where I would normally attempt to give a quick synopsis of what the plot of the opera is. Problem is, in this particular case, that's not really an easy thing to do. To help explain that, you need to know that the opera is split into 4 acts. While certainly not unusual by any means, it does mean the story is relayed in a different manner than one might expect. You don't have your typical 3-act structure we see in most stories. For instance, in a 3-act structure, Act 1 is usually about meeting the characters and setting up what's going to happen in the story. Act 2 is the bulk of the story, and the characters are usually at their low point here. Think like the entire time travel sequence in Avengers Endgame, for instance. And Act 3 is where everything gets resolved. There's like a final battle maybe, or a big fight, or, a lot of different things, but everything comes together, and yeah, I'm oversimplifying that. But honestly, I assume you know what a 3-act story is at this point. So needless to say, you can't have that happen when you have 4 acts. And again, there's nothing wrong with having 4 acts, it just means describing the story is also a little different. So with all of that said, this is, to the best of my ability, a summary of the story of Dolls of New Albion. If you are not confused when I'm done with this, congratulations. Dolls of New Albion begins with an opening song from a narrator who sets the scene of how the city came to be in the first place. We are introduced to a variety of citizens, most of which don't end up being important, along with Annabelle, or Annabella, who is trying to raise the dead. She successfully does so by bringing back a man she loves and creates what's called a doll. They can barely move and barely speak outside of playing the radio. This doll does not like being alive, so Annabelle destroys it and hides her research. She then has a son and dies. Act 2 follows that son named Edgar who is at dinner with a girl he loves, and that girl leaves him at that dinner. Distraught, he happens across a trunk in the attic, which by the way is one of my favorite songs of the opera, and finds Annabelle's formula for raising the dead. He tests it, finds it successful, and makes an entire business out of bringing back people from the dead, and with this he forces the woman that he loved who left him to marry him by bringing back her father, which by pure chance is the same exact person that Annabelle brought back. Despite not loving each other, they have a child named Byron, and Act 3 follows him. At this point, there are countless stalls. They fill the streets and slums and all broadcast the radio. Byron is absolutely in love with the doll that Edgar brought back, which, on a side note, means that Edgar was in love with the daughter of the guy who his mom loved, which is just a little weird. But this doll is named Jasper. A girl named Amelia loves Byron, but honestly is such an afterthought in this act, it's not even worth this sentence. Byron tries to get people to vote for Jasper as mayor for some reason, twice, and Jasper can suddenly sing and does so. His song is about how he doesn't want to be alive, and the rest of the dolls in the city actually connect with this, so they broadcast his song continuously. Amelia kills herself quoting the song, despite literally living in a world where the dead can be brought back. This causes the city to panic and think the dolls are going to kill them or something. Byron accidentally causes this outrage, and so the people turn on the dolls, destroying most of them in bonfires, including Jasper, who is only saved at the last second by Byron. Act 4 once again jumps forward in time as Byron has a daughter named Priscilla, who we now follow. New Albion is now a terrible place to live, entirely under martial law, where being found with a doll is punishable by death. By the way, Brian is dead by this point. But Jasper is still around surprisingly, and so him and Priscilla are playing a never-ending game of cards. Jasper mourns to Priscilla about his existence, but says he's okay with it because he loves her like he once loved his daughter. Remember, his daughter was the one that Annabelle's son forced to marry him literally generations ago. In an actually touching moment, Priscilla calls the police on herself, knowing full well that this will lead to her death. Jasper begs her to leave, but she ultimately stays, and when the police show up, and in an incredible song, execute both Jasper and Priscilla. For some reason, there's then an additional song from a soldier who decided not to shoot and about why he did that, and realizing the government is bad and that he will take them down. There's then one final epilogue song which explains just that. All of that is in just 90 minutes over 25 songs, most of which are around 3 minutes in length, which makes sense. 11 of the 25 songs are actually under 3 minutes, with only 4 being over 5 minutes. The remaining 9 songs are between 3 and 4, which means half of the songs in Dolls of New Albion are incredibly short, yet still need to tell you all of the information in the story I just talked about and everything that I couldn't include. Personally, I actually think it does a really poor job at doing that. And in fact, there's a wiki page that recaps the story of New Albion, and there's information in there I have no idea where it came from. There are just some things I really do not get. But with that said, don't get me wrong, this is actually a really well done album. The individual songs are quite amazing, and there is not really a single bad song. I could listen to just about any of them at any time and thoroughly enjoy it. Annabelle Has a Doll, Annabelle's Lament, Edgar Gets His Heart Broken, The Old Trunk in the Attic, Voodoo Punk, Elysian Night, The Day They Come are all fantastic songs, and they are constantly getting stuck in my head because they are good and worth it. It's only when you actually put them together and try to make a story out of it that it becomes a problem. So with all that said, let's finally take a deeper look into this story so I can explain just what I mean.
Act 1.
Be conscious of the fact that they're still building, that's still going on. But now it's New Albion today.
Does this make
sense? And when you talk about the red-headed dwarf, you know, it's just over my shoulder back here. You know, back there.
Red-headed dwarf who just found out his person does.
Keep going.
Yeah, excessive person does.
Yeah.
That's it.
And which is also on this side, which you know, you're on this side as well, so we're looking over here.
There's prisons made of lead and goggles, bound shreds. And Annabelle McAllister was raising up the dead.
Exactly.
Annabelle McAllister is raising up the dead.
Act 1 contains 6 songs. The first, simply titled Overture, can't really be counted towards the story. It's entirely instrumental and more to tell you that the show is starting than anything else. Not bad, just not really important to the purposes of this video. The second song, titled New Albion, actually starts the opera. This is the song that sets up the history, describes the city, and introduces several of the characters. Sung entirely by the narrator, we learn about how a gambler and a monk had a fierce debate about God and chance and fate, and decided to play a card game to see who was ultimately right. The game lasted so long the city was literally formed around them as people came to watch. We also learn about how the mafia is run by a redhead dwarf with just one eye. We are told about Zeppelin pilots, alchemists, and an aphrodisiac fog, and of course, as mentioned, Annabelle McAllister. It's quite a fantastic song, and the reason I actually got into this opera at all. It seemingly does a really good job of setting up the story and establishing the setting, but as you could probably tell from the plot synopsis I gave earlier, most of these characters that get mentioned aren't actually important. They may come up later in the story, but it is obvious who the main character is, as there is a lot more focus put on Annabelle, at least in comparison to everyone else mentioned. She's the only character mentioned more than once, in fact, and you, the listener, are led to believe she is going to be the focus of the opera. And she is, for 3 songs, and then, like I said, she's dead and never talked about again. But before that happens, the 3rd song of Act 1 is really where the story itself starts. Annabelle raises the dead. It is a direct continuation of what we just ended on, and the entire song is about Annabelle attempting to bring back Jasper. Though, to be clear, we don't actually know anything about the doll at this time. We don't even know that his name is Jasper until much later. We do, however, learn a little bit about Annabelle and a tiny bit about the doll, but unfortunately, in my opinion, it's not really delivered in the best way here. For instance, I've always disliked the line,
You married her as well.
and you would actually be forgiven if you think the expulsion came out of nowhere, because this part of the song is so much slower and is honestly the exposition part. It's easier to understand what she's saying here. But right at the start of verse 2 are the lines,
Here's all my theories and hypotheses and inquiries, no gathering cadavers, and they kicked me out of school.
but when it comes to this doll marrying her, we don't know who her is. On one hand, you could argue that it doesn't really matter, but on the other hand, it actually really does. This doll, Jasper, marrying this other woman and having a daughter with them actually does end up being important to the overall story, but that single line is all we get. It also brings up something that isn't really explained, but probably should have been. How old is Annabelle? When she brings back Jasper, when she brings back this doll, how old is she? Okay, look, Annabelle's age doesn't really matter here, as much as it makes things a little strange and weirder later on. See, in Act 1, Scene 2, New Albion, that opening song, Annabelle is described several times as and I don't know about you, but I've personally never called a grown woman little before. But here in Annabelle Raises the Dead, in which there doesn't seem to be a time gap, she's bringing back someone whom, before they died, were already married and had a child. Which is already weird, by the way. I mean, wouldn't those other two kind of care? But the point being is that it shows Annabelle isn't a kid. She is an adult. She finished school and at least loves someone who is of marrying age, even if maybe she's not at this point. And not to jump too far ahead, but like I said in the synopsis, Annabelle does get married to someone else, has a kid of her own, and then dies when that kid is 10, and then that kid loves and wants to marry the daughter of the dead guy. Meaning that woman, her name is Faye, is at least 10 years older than Edgar. Not really a plot hole, but it is kind of strange, and I really don't think that was intentional. I think this is just one of those things that Paul Shapera didn't realize.
So it's a matter of just saying, New Albion, Annabelle has a doll, 3 a.m. So that's, oh, I just saw her made a doll. Fantastic. And that's what that song's about, in one line.
Annabelle does successfully raise Jasper from the dead and leads into song 4, Annabelle Has a Doll. This is a lot of people's favorite song of the entire opera, and for good reason. It's an incredible song. It's very upbeat, happy, and you really get to know Annabelle. We really do learn a lot about her. She hated going outside, she likes ice cream and carriages, and now that she has her doll, is ready to face the world again. She is revitalized, she is alive, but Jasper can't talk to her. She desperately wishes that he can, but it's made a point that Jasper can't talk to her, as he can only play the radio. Which he does, playing a song that goes, and honestly, it's a good question. Obviously, Annabelle couldn't ask Jasper if he wanted to be brought back to life, but he also very clearly wasn't okay with it. It brings up a lot of very interesting questions though. And if you've never listened to the album before, this is probably the part where you start thinking you know where the story is going, what's going to happen, and that it sounds interesting. I mean, Annabelle brought back a dead guy who doesn't want to be alive again. He hates his existence, but can only communicate it through radio songs. So what happens? Does Annabelle even have a right to bring him back? What exactly does it mean for him? What is his experience even like now? Does he still get hungry, or does being a doll cover those and other necessities? But he also makes Annabelle incredibly happy, happier than she's ever been according to this song. Is it right for her to keep him around for her own happiness? And there are also several questions just about Jasper even being alive again, like now that he is back, can he die again? Can he be killed or grow old again? What does bringing back someone from the dead even mean? Yeah, if you wanted any answers, sorry, none of it matters apparently. None of that gets answered or is even ever talked about. Literally, any of the questions you might find yourself asking from this song don't matter. Instead, it's like we skip a few chapters and go directly into Annabelle's lament, where, quite obviously, Annabelle is lamenting over bringing Jasper back and ends up destroying him, whatever that means, because it's literally never explained. That's the line that's used. And then she hides her formula for raising the dead. Annabelle's Lament is actually a great song, and it is one of my all-time favorites. It's very emotional, but it doesn't have the impact that it could have, because we are still just getting to know these characters. We barely know Annabelle at all. We just met her 10 minutes ago. And Jasper was literally created in the last song and only said a few lines, most of which were repeated. You can't really lament a character that was just introduced and expect it to have an emotional impact. Annabelle's Lament actually ends up being a lot better when you listen to it on its own, completely out of context. I'm going to talk about this way more later on at the end of this video, but can you imagine how much more emotional the song would be if the entire story was about this? Imagine if this was the moment where the story was leading to, like the last song kind of makes it seem. It would be absolutely incredible to explore those questions and all those possibilities I brought up, all leading to this moment where Annabelle decides she needs to let go and move on. And I want you to keep that in mind. It would kind of be like Luke learning Darth Vader is his father and saying, "That's not true, that's impossible. Search your feelings, you know it to be true." And then Luke goes, "I know that you were once Anakin Skywalker, my father. That name no longer has any meaning to me. There is good in you, I can sense the conflict. There is no conflict in me." Sure, you're hitting the same points we ultimately get, but you're also leaving out a lot of information and buildup that really makes this work. Emotional impacts need time. You need to be able to get to know the characters, learn about them, and actually spend time with them. And unfortunately, this is not the only instance in Dolls of New Albion where this happens. As the final song of Act 1 basically simply says that Annabelle destroys her dolls and is sad again. Like, that's almost literally all it says. So when you take a step back and look, Act 1 only has 4 story-related songs. One which is just setting up the world, and then the entire story of Annabelle told in 17 minutes over the next 3 songs. And remember how earlier I brought up that 4 songs in the opera are over 5 minutes long? 3 of those are Annabelle's songs. So we do get to spend a good amount of time with her, more than we do any of the other characters for the rest of this opera for that matter, but the entire opera really should have been focused on her. Part of me would have liked to see these 3 songs as the full story, but that didn't happen, And it didn't happen because, I believe, Paul Shapera wanted to make a trilogy of blank punk operas and he needed the time to go from one to the other. Dolls of New Albion is a steampunk opera, the sequel, the New Albion Radio Hour, I believe, is a diesel punk opera, and then the third story is an atom punk. I have no problem with him wanting to make these 3 operas in these 3 styles, but I do believe there were far better ways to make that happen, even if he did need so much time to pass. However, like I said, that didn't happen, and so instead of getting a well-developed story of a single character and all the moral quandaries her actions entail, we move on to Act 2.
Act 2.
If you've ever listened to a musical, then you know that everyone has like a big song in the middle. I have no idea if there is a proper term for this, but you do know what I'm talking about. I mean songs like One Day More or Defying Gravity. You know, that song that has been built up to in one way or another. It's impactful, but it's also not the finale. Similarly, musicals also want to start with hits to bring the audience in. No One Mourns the Wicked or even something like Circle of Life, and while I wouldn't compare New Albion the song to either of those, it is really good and does that job just fine. Endings are a little different and we're going to talk about them when we get there, but there's always that song in the middle that is memorable. At least I personally think there is in every musical that I've listened to. Dolls of New Albion doesn't have one of those though. Not really. There are tracks I could easily see people arguing to be that song, but I personally don't think one exists, and if it does, it's definitely not in Act 2. Act 2 is the shortest of all of them, containing only 5 songs. The first is titled New Albion 2. This will be an ongoing theme. This is when we learn that a lot of time has passed, Annabelle married and had the child named Edgar, and he is who we are going to follow this time around. Edgar has fallen in love with a woman named Faye, who he wanted to marry. Despite having literally no impact in Act 1 at all, we also learn about the redhead dwarf with just one eye who had a son and how that son kills him, and he's really proud of it. In fact, we learn about a lot of new characters that don't end up mattering, and retroactively, this actually does hurt that opening song of the entire album, New Albion 1, because when you first hear it, even though you can assume that most of these characters aren't really going to be that important, it is establishing the setting. Yet, this time jump has basically made all of that irrelevant as New Albion, the city, is now different. And subconsciously, you're recognizing this. If the things from the first song end up not mattering, it makes you wonder what from this song is important, or how much of it is even going to be relevant 10 minutes from now. Spoilers, it's almost entirely irrelevant. The second song of Act 2 is Edgar Gets His Heart Broken. Let me just start off by saying that I really do like this song, but it is very weird. We are literally thrown into the middle of a scene with no idea of what's really happening. Edgar is having dinner with Faye, the woman he loves, and she just leaves him. The song doesn't lead into this or anything. It's not like it leads up to it at like the halfway point. No, Faye leaving him is literally the 5th line of this song. Edgar actually gets really mad at this, and because we just met him, it comes across as a bit of an overreaction when he sings, and I actually really like that motif. It sounds good, but like Annabelle's Lament, it would have actually been better if we knew who this character was. I mean, it is a decent song with some incredible parts and some equally awkward parts too. The second verse in particular is a little out there as it talks about the food they were having and what Edgar would have had. With all the questions I've built up by this point of the musical, what was Edgar eating really isn't one of them. But, who the hell is Edgar? Is. Yeah, we do know that he's Annabelle's son, but so far that's kind of all we know. In Annabelle's first song, we actually are introduced to her, giving the audience a bit of her backstory, what she's like, and we just don't get that here with Edgar. Telling me he had the prawns with mango doesn't actually say anything about him. But despite that, it does actually end up being a very enjoyable song to listen to, and one that I've put on repeat many times. And this is something that never actually gets resolved in this act, by the way. We don't really learn more about Edgar outside of the fact that he's vengeful. And considering he is now the focus of the opera, at least for Act 2, it really causes the story to drop significantly. Act 2 is my least favorite, and from here on out, it's a little hard to care about the story when it's not even developing itself. In fact, only one important thing happens here, and we'll talk about that when we get there. The next song in Act 2 is one of my favorites in the entire opera, titled The Old Trunk in the Attic. It's definitely slower than all the other songs sung so far, but it is done so beautifully. The melody is almost haunting and intentionally slow. Edgar, who is distraught, is looking through, as the song says, an old trunk in the attic. He is pulling things out, and it talks about everything that he's finding. There's things from his grandmother, a small dress that was never worn, and the whole song leads to Edgar finding Annabelle's formula for raising up the dead, or I guess Annabella's. The opera keeps going back and forth. In fact, if I had to come up with a downside for the song, it's that it is under 2 minutes long. Then we move straight on to Edgar Builds a Business, which is a much more upbeat song, and the fourth and final song that is over 5 minutes long. Here, Edgar takes the research he got from his mother and makes a business out of raising people from the dead and turning them into dolls. He's improved on these mechanical bodies, and it goes very well and is very successful for him. Edgar uses this to fulfill his vengeance, ruining Silophus's life. Siloph, of course, being the man who Faye left him for, and this is literally the only time that he is ever mentioned. This song is also quite fun to listen to, the melody is catchy, and I really enjoy it. And it's in this song that only important thing happens. Because despite everything else that happens in Act 2, which honestly isn't much, this is the only one that actually ends up mattering. Edgar, in order to try and win Faye's love back, brings back her father from the dead. That man, as I mentioned before, is actually the same man who Annabelle brought back in Act 1, and you might think that this would be important for some very obvious reasons. I mean, this isn't real life, this isn't a true story. Paul Shapera intentionally chose to make it the same person. He chose to make the doll Annabelle brought back Faye's father. But why? And no, I'm actually being serious here. I would really like to know why. There is a very slight purpose for it in Act 4, but I really don't see why it has to be the same person. Because in making it the same person, it adds a lot more questions that never get answered. Like all the stuff about Faye's age that I already talked about, but also, this is a person who has been brought back twice now. That has implications. Like, is there a limit? How many times can someone be brought back? Is he different now than he was the first time? And of course, is he okay with it this time? For that matter, are any of the dolls okay with having been brought back? Yeah, Edgar made a very successful business out of it, but I find it hard to believe Annabelle wouldn't have included why she abandoned the research, especially if it was successful, and Edgar, despite also knowing that it's successful, never questioned any of this. I find it hard to believe that not a single person thought the dolls might not want to be alive, or that the dolls didn't protest like Jasper did the first time around. The entire point of Annabelle's lament was about how bringing Jasper back was a mistake, and raising the dead is a mistake. The entire point was about how no matter how much she wanted it, she's literally playing with someone else's life and forcing them to live a new miserable experience beyond their will. All of that means nothing when a new character we don't really care about is just going to do it all again anyway, ignoring all the implications and questions, and the opera itself ignores the consequences. Yeah, I know what happens in Act 3, we'll get there, but it doesn't make sense for the story to even have to get to that point in the first place. And again, this is another one of the reasons I say that the story should have revolved around Annabelle and her story. Instead of getting 3 songs and nothing more, we really should have focused on that journey. Because now, things are convoluted, not very well explained, and you've probably lost a lot of your audience who are just now going to be listening to the pretty sounding music. Then, the final song of Act 2 is actually from Faye's perspective.
So you blame yourself?
Well, I'm a little bit like, yeah.
Weak choice.
Really?
I think you have a stronger choice.
Okay.
I think you got moral high ground to play here.
Okay.
Like he's destroyed your life, and you know he's a worm. You know he's a prick. Not that you,
Yeah.
what you
I
know.
have to do things like that.
Well, you don't, because the thing is he was nice, but once upon a time. But in the meantime, he's become this monster, and he's created this industry where all these dead people are coming around. So you've got to, in your character, that last entrance, we've got to see a lot of. You've got to process. We don't have to see it, but you just have to process. How do you feel about his business? How do you feel about him and what he's become? Has he ruined other people's lives?
Yeah.
You know, how has he summoned you? Why has he summoned you? Was it you will come, or has he been sending letters every week for the last 12 years? You know, with no reply, and you've just ignored him. All of this backstory thing fits into when we see you in his entrance.
Yeah.
And for him, you're one of the only people on the planet who can actually tell him to fuck off, because he's become so powerful and so rich, he would destroy anybody else who said that. But he wouldn't do that.
No.
And when you actually, do you go with him? That's a question. We know with the musical what happens. In this moment, we don't know. And do you go with him to get your revenge? Like, what's your decision when you say "My heart burns"? You will know when you sing at the end of the act.
Yeah.
Have you decided? Yeah, I'll get back together with you cocksucker, so I can cut your balls off while you're sleeping.
No, it's more.
Or is it?
It's more like, well, I'm gonna make you suffer just as much as you made everybody else and me suffer.
Make it more personal. Not everybody. I mean, it can be everybody else, but make it personal. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And did you know that he's brought your father back to life? Like, that's another thing that he says. He talks about.
Does he say that? Do I have my mistake? He says that when he says, "Baby, to see you, I actually so."
The way it's presented in the lyrics is, I've destroyed your man.
Yeah.
And by the way, I've got your dad in my living room.
Yeah.
And if you ever want to see him again, did you know that your dad's grave was robbed, or did you hear anything about this? Is it the first time? So you've got to decide whether or not that's new information, if it's expected behavior on his part, if it's...
We're done with Edgar. We never see him again. That's literally it. Faye broke up with him, he got upset, found the formula for raising the dead, made a business out of it, and that's it. That's not an entire story, it's not a character arc, it's like a chapter or two. Where in Act 1, you at least got a sense of closure with Annabelle, even though you didn't know it, we don't really get that in Act 2. We're just left feeling like there should be more, because there should be. In Act 1, each of Annabelle's songs were over 5 minutes. Here, Edgar's first 2 songs combined aren't even as long as his third one is. There is no time to get to know him or care, and so ultimately, we don't. We don't even have time not to care, because when the story of Act 2 actually gets going, it's over and we're on to Act 3.
Act 3.
In my opinion, Act 3 is a huge step up. Act 2 honestly just kinda sucked, but here, every song is great, upbeat, and just so much fun to listen to. The story is a little weird to follow, and not only because we are basically starting over again. For the third time now, we are learning about new characters, and New Albion, the city, is very different as well. Like 1 and 2, Act 3 begins with a song explaining what's happening in New Albion 3. Unlike New Albion 1 and 2, this one doesn't talk about the characters of the city, but instead actually explains things. Despite a loveless marriage, Edgar and Faye had a son named Byron, who is now the focus. Jasper, who is only named for the first time here, by the way, is still around, and Byron is in love with him. Edgar's business was incredibly successful, and so now dolls are filling the streets, slums, and homes, and there are countless of them. There's also a subculture called voodoo punk, where Byron and Amelia are involved, and if you're wondering who Amelia is, don't worry, so is the story. For some reason, the voodoo punks decide that they want to mock the world, so they're gonna have a doll run for city mayor. That's more exposition, and in a good way, than we got in all of Act 2. It's almost like Act 2 wasn't necessary, and with some minor tweaks, you could have had a 3-act structure where you probably could have actually gotten to know your characters. But we'll talk about that later. The second, third, and fourth song of this act can basically be seen as one. That's partly due to the fact that the second song is called Movement 1, where Byron is attempting to get people to join his voodoo punk movement. That's really all it is. It's a wonderful song, albeit a little bit different than anything else in the opera, And I feel obligated to say that Amelia is present here and supposedly is showing that she loves Byron, but it's not mutual. At least that's what the wiki says, but I don't really see it. It's what's supposed to be happening, and that is confirmed in a few songs, but I really just don't see it here. If you're watching this in a live performance, it is easier to get this across, even though I never saw it there either. But if you're like most people and you're just listening to this, you're not going to get that impression at all. And that's because there is literally a single line in this song that is meant to give you that impression, but it doesn't have the effect because of how it's done. Amelia, who is never the focus of this song and is primarily singing backup amongst a crowd for that matter, at one point says the line. She is also alone in singing that line, and if you're listening for it, it does actually stand out. So with that alone, sure, I can easily see how someone might see that as Amelia saying Byron doesn't love her. However, you need to add the context of the rest of the song. The full lyrics that Amelia sings there are, as you could tell, everything except that last line is actually sung with the crowd of voodoo punks. And so, yes, the emphasis is on that last line, which would be fine if it wasn't almost word for word, with only the third line being different from what Byron sings at the beginning of the song.
Jasper, love is why I do in the movement, the love I never get from you.
Making this seem more like a callback and continuation of that theme and motif, instead of Amelia making a statement of her own. Simply cutting off the voodoo punk crowd from singing that line with her isn't really enough to get that across. Even more so when it's like a third of the way through the song, and the focus of this piece comes after that, immediately pulling everyone's attention away from it and towards the important parts of the plot in Act 3. Which is Byron trying to get people to vote for Jasper as mayor. It's exceptionally well done, but that's what it is.
Wait, for voodoo punk leader, for voodoo punk.
The next song, Voodoo Punk, is fantastic. There's actually not anything to say here. The lyrics are pretty nonsensical and there's no story in the song. It's just a fun scene and a fun song. I constantly have this on repeat. I'm constantly sending it to my girlfriend. And if I didn't live on the second floor, I would probably be dancing to it too. Also, if I knew how to dance. Look, I might be cynical, but I'm not going to complain about everything. I realize that not everything needs to have a point. Realistically, this song could be taken out of the opera and you would lose nothing, but it is a lot of fun. And if you watch the live performance I've linked down below, you'll see just how much fun the performers are having with this number. So with that, we finish this mini triplet with the movement 2. This does immediately calm things down again, and it's extremely similar to the Movement 1, of course. And because of that, actually has a similar issue to what I had with the Movement 1. This time around, the beginning is sung only by Amelia, and when you look at the lyrics, you can tell that the things she's saying are talking about Brian, or to Brian. However, calling this the Movement 2 automatically makes your mind think this is just a continuation of the Movement 1, which it technically is. It uses the same lyrics to start with, and then changes the voodoo punk crowd comes in, and then completely changes when Byron speaks, again trying to get people to vote for Jasper. So if you look at the lyrics, it's easy to see how Amelia is trying to gain Byron's love, but that's not what the song itself is portraying. If this story of Amelia was so important, she deserved to get songs of her own and be the focus, not just a background contributor to other people's songs, because make no mistake, both Movement pieces are very much Byron pieces. And one thing I also need to point out is that Jasper can kind of speak now, sort of. It's explained over the years that he's taken words and instrumentations from the music he channels and made his own song so he can speak to the crowd. That song is the next track, Elysian Night. If you remember way back in Act 1 when Annabelle was trying to get her doll to speak to her, it sung, and Jasper obviously uses some of that song here.
Childhood friend you knew was there, but never saw or touched, and where they went when never called again, the place their loneliness all ends. All the sorrow, guilt and shame, burdens borne in karma paid, and one soft breath like candlelight dispersed in endless Elysian
For the record, Elysian is quite an appropriate word, meaning characteristic of heaven or paradise, or simply, Elysium is often equated directly to paradise itself. So, in Act 1, Jasper was literally asking, why was he taken from there? You would think that would probably come up in all these years again, but I guess not. Elysian Night, and yes it is Elysian and not Elysium, which are one and the same but whatever, is actually a very good song. Again, one of my favorites. It's actually saying that Jasper is not okay being brought back again, and it resonates with the rest of the dolls in the city who start playing it non-stop because, yeah, they're motionless husks that have been left to rot, basically. This does actually bring up a slight problem that I didn't realize until this point in the musical, and that is that we never see any other dolls like Jasper. We do see other dolls, as, like I said, they're filling the slums and whatnot, but they're all motionless and stuck, and none of them are like Jasper. We don't see anyone that's useful, and I want you to keep that in mind. Okay, this is the Suicide song. You really only know that because of the title, and I am going to talk about why this song doesn't work so well, but not what happens in it. However, for those of you who may be uncomfortable with this, the timestamp to skip to is on screen now. I will be continuing in 3, 2, 1. This song is why Amelia is an afterthought in the rest of this act. She is the one who kills herself in this song. Something like that deserves the impact it's trying to get across. If you are listening to this album for the first time, you don't know who this girl is. You don't know she's been present the entire time because she really hasn't been. So when the narrator introduces her as
There's a girl in a small flat with a cruel father who's quite sad, and she listens a deep compassion.
It feels like we're meeting her for the first time. Amelia then proceeds to sing much of Elysian Night again with some changed lyrics. And this is the third time that an emotional song just doesn't hit. All 3 times because we didn't get to know the character. Annabelle's Lament is probably the most emotional and works the best, but Edgar Gets His Heart Broken doesn't work at all in that sense, and this is basically the same. Amelia and her story are done in such a way that she's basically non-existent, so they had to throw in an extra layer at this last second to show why she's important. I actually have a theory that Amelia wasn't in the rest of this act at all, and that was a retroactive decision, and that's based entirely off of the fact that she's introduced as
There's a girl in a small flat.
and is given a backstory here, but not before. I think this song was written and then Paul Shapera realized it didn't have the impact he wanted to and was honestly a little random, so he went back and included Amelia in the rest of the act, but because he had already written it, he couldn't do too much and threw her in where he could, adding in a reference and then leaving her to be in the background. There is, of course, one really big issue with this plot point existing. She literally lives in a world where death has been solved. She is literally in a world where if someone wanted her to be brought back, they could, even if she didn't want it. And despite the dolls not being okay being brought back, and that's exactly what leads Amelia to this, realizing the paradise that lies beyond, which again is something that never gets talked about, if her father wanted to bring her back, he could, easily. We have seen that in this show. And these are the problems that come up when you don't take the time to actually explain things. I'm not saying that every last detail needs to be explained, but you can probably see some of the problems of just moving things along quickly. Also, really quick, in the next song it is explained that Amelia's suicide note had the lyrics to Elysian Night on them and it got published everywhere. I needed to include that here so I could talk about the next song without it. So we move on to the final song of Act 3, Bonfire of the Dolls. I've never really understood this one. People are really upset because of what Amelia did and they blame the dolls. Byron accidentally incites them, making them want to kill all the dolls, and they basically do. All around town, people grab dolls and throw them into bonfires. Byron, who, might I remind you, is still in love with Jasper, who, by the way, is his grandfather, searches frantically for him. Finding him right before he gets thrown into a fire and saving him. It's a really good song, but when you take a step back to think about what is happening, it really doesn't make much sense. First, it was established that most of the dolls weren't doing anything. We started this act learning that they were filling the slums, they can't physically move or do anything. And this is where not having other dolls like Jasper is kind of important, because if we had seen them, then this would make more sense. But second, and way more importantly, the dolls wanted to die again. While this reaction definitely was not Jasper's intention with his song, the end result kind of was. He was saying he didn't want to be alive again. None of the dolls did. So killing them is just giving them what they wanted. Doing so in rage isn't really necessary, and it doesn't make sense. It's like if I told you I wanted a burger and someone else said we should go to McDonald's, so for some reason you got mad and then bought me a burger anyway. I still got what I wanted in the end and would have been okay with it being done in other means, but you took extra steps to make that happen. The dolls wanted to die again. They wanted to. There was no need for a riot and rage. The dolls would have accepted it. But also, Brian accidentally causing this riot also doesn't actually make sense. If you listen to it, it does.
It won't be too long, folks, till our doll runs this town. We're voting him in, and it's happening now. We stand at the crossroads where worlds connect, and your children are dancing each night with the dead. Kill the dolls, kill the dolls.
Everyone screams.
Now hold on, my friends, this is not what we mean.
But what I mean is, there wasn't a need for it either. In fact, when you actually listen to it, you probably aren't going to get the impression that it was an accident, because his words totally are saying that it's the doll's fault. But in his mind, his words are good. He's talking about Jasper being voted in and sees that as a good thing. It's just really, really stupid of him to have said that when Jasper just caused what he caused. Again, it's an enjoyable song, just don't stop to think about it. But with that, we move on to Act 4.
Act 4.
Act 4 is the most different of the acts. It starts different, it's way more concise, and it's also really, really good. Not that the other acts weren't, but Act 4 pulls everything together and ends this opera on a fantastic note. Where the first 3 acts begin with one of the songs New Albion 1, 2, or 3, Act 4 actually doesn't do that. Instead, we start by going back in time to the very beginning of New Albion, the city, back to when the gambler and the monk were playing cards. The ballad of the gambler and the monk is honestly okay. I really don't think that it's needed, and I feel like it says a lot that the description of the song is nothing more than Kate talks more in depth about New Albion's founding. It's literally just a song to remind you that these two characters exist and they were playing cards. On a side note, the narrator is never named in the show at all, at least not as far as I was able to see, so I'm not entirely certain where the name Kate came from. In fact, the only thing I can think of, assuming I just didn't miss it being named, is that in the live recording I've been showing this whole time, the narrator is played by a woman named Kate Young. That's the only idea I have, but if you happen to know why the narrator is named Kate or where she is named, please do let me know. And that's actually all I have to say about this song because it ultimately doesn't really matter. It feels like a pause in the story and it pretty much is. I'm absolutely certain anyone familiar with this opera is going to disagree with me on that, and so I will say and make it clear that I do understand the whole point of the gambler and the monk. But 1, you gotta trust your audience, and 2, it doesn't do anything for the story, so we're just gonna move on. The second act of Song 4 is what you probably expected, New Albion number 4. This time around, it's actually similar to New Albion 3, meaning it's telling us information we actually need to know instead of just establishing the setting again. Byron got a trophy wife and was married, and he had a daughter named Priscilla. She is of course going to be the lead in Act 4. The riots at the end of Act 3 actually did a lot of damage and caused the city to go into martial law. This caused the city to turn into a police state, and owning a doll was now illegal and punishable by death. As someone with parents who grew up in Argentina, the line,
It's forbidden if found you may or may not be seen again.
was a little bit relatable. In the middle of this song though, we are introduced to a new character, Soldier 7285, though not named here, we do learn his name later.
And on this day of my enlistment, I shed my skin off well and innocent. I pledge allegiance and devotion. I'll be the power that you flex.
It's a quick verse explaining how he is enlisting to the police force, and the tune of his verse is used throughout this entire act, and though his introduction here is a little random, I'm personally glad that it's included. The song continues explaining that Jasper is still alive despite making it very clear that he didn't want to be and is spending his days with Priscilla. She hides inside all day with him and plays that never-ending game of cards. Similarly to the movements 1 and 2, the next 3 songs here really do feel like just one. They really flow together, complement each other, and honestly they act as one big finale to this opera. Song 3 is Priscilla and Jasper play cards, and it is absolutely incredible. I love the song, I love the melody. Though not my favorite song of the opera, this melody is up there, and it is one of the most well-written pieces in the entire show.
Clouds fade and rays. In this parlor, in this never-ending game we play, and we hide just you and I, as day fades into day. In
In it, Priscilla and Jasper, well, they play cards. Look, that one wasn't too hard to figure out, but just like the gambler and the monk, it's not really about the card game. For some reason, Jasper can actually talk now, like talk now, and that's just a thing that happens. It's not too hard to assume that after learning to sing, he just continued to improve on that, so it's not really that weird. Anyway, the two talk about this never-ending game they are playing when Jasper says the only way to win is to sacrifice. The scene shifts back to Soldier 7285, who is now executing dolls and people. His verse continues the theme of the motif that we heard when he was first introduced, and again, like I said, it is done throughout this act. While it is complementing exactly what Jasper just said, it is also acting as a constant reminder that the police force is there and that the martial law state is underway. They are out there and they are getting closer. And then Jasper straight up says, he literally tells Priscilla he wants to die again. Again. This isn't the first time he's said this, obviously. I mean, him trying to say this is directly responsible for the current state of New Albion after all, but it is the first time he was able to say it so precisely, and Priscilla actually gets really confused by this. While in the context specifically of Priscilla's story, I can understand that and even accept it, this is the first song we have with her, and we don't really know anything about her yet. It's sort of implied she's a little on the younger end, so I can accept her not knowing this about Jasper. But as an audience member though, who has now sat through almost an hour of the show, it's kind of the only thing we know about Jasper, as it's really all we've seen from him. Again, I really like this song and this entire act, but like the rest of the opera, the story tends to fall apart when you take a step back and look at it. But Jasper's words do actually get to Priscilla. She steps away and contemplates in the next song titled Priscilla Contemplates. Look, you've probably noticed that none of the titles in this opera are all too creative. Most of them are about exactly what happens. This song is a little bit slower to start with, but it really picks up to this emotionally driven explosion where Priscilla realizes that yes, in order to win this game she plays, one must sacrifice. She must give up that which she loves. She doesn't want to live without Jasper. Jasper doesn't want to live. She must make the choice to let him go and move on. Now wait, why does that sound familiar?
Some desire to yearn inside. These odes are piercing canter, dew-eyed candor, withering the world. The world that just deceives you, beats and bleeds you, and leaves lonely little girls and some sacrifice.
So she does the only thing she can do. She calls the police on herself, knowing full well this will lead to her end, and Jasper knows it too. He begs her to leave and flee, to let himself die and let herself live, but she chooses not to and stays. This is honestly an incredible piece, and I do have more to say about it, but we're going to move on to the finale of the opera, The Day They Come. It's no secret that endings are incredibly important. They can make or break your story. There's a now infamous example of Game of Thrones, for instance, where the final season as a whole, and especially the final episode, really soured the experience and the show for countless people. I'm sure right now you can think of at least a few examples where the ending of a movie or a book ruined the story for you. For some reason, Knowing was the first one that came into my mind. You know, that one weird movie with Nicolas Cage? Yeah, that one. Repo Man was another one for me. I actually looked up some lists to see what other people would say, and apparently Passengers has a really bad ending. I have no idea, I've never seen that. On the other hand, great endings can have the opposite effect, where they elevate an alright story into something good or amazing. Rogue One is one of my favorite Star Wars movies, but even I will admit the first two acts are a little slow and there are some weird scenes. But that third act is phenomenal and alone is worth watching the movie for. The entirety of Act 4 in Dolls of New Albion is really good, But The Day They Come is like the Darth Vader scene at the end of Rogue One. It is that moment that you wait for. And what's funny is that it can actually be summed up incredibly simply. Soldier 7285 and 2 other police members show up, kill Jasper, and execute Priscilla. But it's also so much more than that. This song is the culmination of all the themes we've been seeing and hearing throughout the opera so far. The constant motif, which has been present from the beginning, is there. Jasper's theme, Soldier 7285's theme, even the and of course, moments from Annabelle 2, all of this being mixed together wonderfully into this absolutely incredible piece.
And on this day we come, it's over. And you will have your fate laid out and spun. It's execution, and you may pray if you get comfort. One day you will learn. It's on that day your duty's done. You will burst and cry hard. One day you will guilty, and you will burst and cry hard. One day you will burst, and you will burst and cry hard. It will be carried out this system. All the pain, all the prayers that you once said.
But remember how I said I was going to talk more about that last song? Well, I have one question. Do you care about Priscilla? Or do you care that you're hearing all the motifs from the opera coming together? I'm sure you probably care about Jasper at this point, which is why I didn't find it necessary to ask. Because we just met Priscilla, blank start yet again for the 4th time now. She's Annabelle's son's daughter. We know literally nothing about her at all, except for she likes spending time with Jasper. That's the one trait about her that we know. So you'd be absolutely forgiven if you didn't care for her, because honestly, you're not given much reason to. So despite how wonderful this ending is, and it is wonderful, it doesn't work because of the characters, it works because of the music. And yeah, one could say that's the point of an opera, but imagine how much more powerful this ending would be if we had stuck with Annabelle the entire time. In fact, they intentionally used the same singer for Annabelle and Priscilla, so your mind is connecting the two. But imagine how much more impactful and how much more meaningful these songs and moments would be if it wasn't just Annabelle's voice, but Annabelle herself coming to the realization that Jasper really doesn't want to be alive anymore and that she needs to let go. It would be incredibly emotional. Way more than it already is, and while it would require changes to the story, not all that many. But before I get into those and talk about how I think the story could have been better, I need to talk about what fans of New Albion have probably been pulling their hair out over. This actually isn't the finale of the opera. It absolutely should be, but there are actually 2 songs after this. One, the actual final song is like an epilogue and it just tells you the story's over. That one I don't mind so much and it's totally fine. But the song immediately after The Day They Come is called I Will Bring You Down, and it's actually really good. But like I said way back in the synopsis, it's really just here to set up a sequel. Because every character we've met in the entire opera except Jasper was incredibly short-lived, the message of this song doesn't really work. Soldier 7285 doesn't shoot Priscilla. He couldn't. She is executed by someone else. By the way, the live recording I've been showing this whole time, for some reason they leave out the incredibly important part of this song, which actually says that 7285 didn't shoot and has been discharged. I mean, they cover it in a different way, but the opera was produced by the guy who wrote it. I haven't actually listened to the sequel yet, but the one thing I'm certain of is Soldier 7285 probably won't even be in it, making this song kind of pointless, honestly, especially when you could just start the sequel with that, but whatever, it's fine. It's not a bad song, I just don't think it needed to be here. So with that said, let's end all of this by taking a brief look at what I think could have been done differently.
Act 5.
I've made it very clear by now that I personally believe this opera should have focused entirely on Annabelle as the sole main character, with Jasper at her side. There are a lot of choices in this opera I don't necessarily agree with, but the one big change is that. I don't understand why this opera had to take place over 4 generations. There isn't really a point to it. And while not everything needs a point, decisions like that kind of need a reason. Take Star Wars, for example, because it's what I know. Star Wars covers 3 generations over the course of 9 movies. 3 follow Anakin, 3 follow Luke, and 3 follow Ben, because yes, Ben is the real Skywalker. If Star Wars had been done like Dolls of New Albion, there wouldn't be 9 movies, but only 3. 1 following Anakin, 1 following Luke, and 1 following Ben. Right away, even if you've never seen Star Wars, you can tell the problem with that. Having to fit 3 movies into 1 is going to cause you to lose information and important details. Character development will be left out, emotional moments won't have the same impact, and things probably won't make as much sense. I mean, look at what happened to the non-existent Avatar The Last Airbender live-action movie. It tried to fit the entirety of Season 1 into a 90-minute movie, and it failed. It also failed for a lot of other reasons, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But that's actually not how it would be done. No, if Star Wars was made like New Albion, then it would all be a single movie where the first act covered Anakin, the second act covered Luke, and the third act covered Ben. And that's a problem. Because now not only are you cutting out a ton of useful information, but you don't have any time to spend with any of these characters. So much is going to be left out, a lot won't even make sense, and none of it is really going to be necessary. Focusing the story entirely on Annabelle would have allowed it to breathe. When you look at Acts 2, 3, and 4 as a whole, it's not too hard to see how one could make that happen. For instance, as a whole, not much actually happens in Act 2. The story itself doesn't really change in any significant way. Think about it. What happens in Act 1? Well, Annabelle learns how to raise the dead, does so, and then realizes Jasper doesn't want to be alive, so she destroys him. What happens in Act 2? Edgar learns how to raise the dead, does so, and the act ends with him bringing back who else but Jasper. And if that was going to be the case all along, and Jasper was to play as big of a role as he does, what was the point of destroying him at the end of Act 1 to begin with? Instead of ending one character's story right as it was beginning, throwing us into the middle of an emotional scene with someone we just met and don't care about, and had we actually stuck with Annabelle, she could have been the one to start the business. And it would work. Remember that line from Annabelle Has a Doll where she says,
The only thing my mother said is that one must be a success.
I think you could consider that being a success. We could have had actual character development too. Imagine if Annabelle, ignoring or not even realizing Jasper's pleas, creates an entire business with her dolls. It's so successful, they're all over town, everybody has one, and they might even elect one as mayor. Now you jump to the end of the story where Annabelle realizes what she's done and how Jasper hates this existence. But on top of that, she has the weight of all the dolls of New Albion too. Because she is directly responsible for learning how to bring them back and did so, and she forced countless people to live meaningless and painful existences despite them not wanting to, and she caused New Albion to fall apart and turn into the military state it is. So now, when you get to the end and see all of that weighing on her, Now her sacrifice not only makes much more sense, but is way more impactful because you actually care about her, the problems she faced, the things she did, and all that led to her making that decision. It's not just some random character we don't know who happens to have the same voice as Annabelle. It's Annabelle. That's why I say Annabelle should have been the main character throughout the entire opera, because doing so makes these moments work. From a behind-the-scenes perspective, the show was created in such a way to have minimal cast and crew. Annabelle, Faye, Amelia, and Priscilla are all performed by the same person. Edgar, Byron, and Soldier 7285 as well. Realistically, the opera only needs 4 singers, including Jasper and the narrator, and yeah, there is that voodoo punk song with the crowd, and I would hate to lose it, but like I said earlier, it doesn't actually add anything, it's just a fun song. Point being, if the show is designed to have the same people play different characters, why not just have them play the same characters? I don't know. Actually, I really don't know. Even with the flaws, I did really enjoy this opera though, and I will definitely continue to do so. If I didn't like it, I would not have made this hour-long video, potentially introducing new people to it. Guess the only thing I can do now is listen to that sequel, right? The new Albion Radio Hour. I bet it's just as good, right?
2 hours later.
Oh. Thank you for watching me rant about the Dolls of New Albion for the last hour. If you've never seen it, I would still highly recommend doing so. And if this video was something that you liked, then consider liking and subscribing. I'm probably never going to talk about a musical again, maybe. But anyway, thank you for watching. And make sure to check out my LEGO channel in the description down below.